Welcome to Trench Diaries and welcome to another story. If you are new to this channel, welcome. I'll be with you shortly. If you are a regular visitor, welcome back. It's good to see you again. Feel free to skip to the displayed timecode for my introduction to the book as well as the first chapter. For those of you that are first-time viewers, this is Trench Diaries, where I present the personal stories of soldiers throughout the history of human conflict. Some of these books are the original versions which I translate myself, others are the official English editions. I read a variety of books and accounts and try to add some personal insight and research since I have served myself in the German army and am a captain of the reserve. I call this personal touch, if you will, the after-action report and present it at the end of each episode where I discuss things that I found interesting or present some research that I did concerning some parts of the story that stood out to me. I will also talk about German history, German culture, as well as German food, should it be mentioned at some point during the book. The main point of this channel is to present the human side of war, with all its nuances and intricacies. This channel is not about politics or current day issues, but the personal experiences of humans at the front during the darkest times of history. It is about the personal motivations, hopes and dreams of the authors at the time, and the stories should be treated as such and not with the arrogance of hindsight. You will find that many times you can probably relate to a lot of what the authors have to say about life, and at the same time you will probably disagree with other things. That is completely normal. The point is that all of them were people with their own lives, and these lives were not black and white. If that is something that interests you, then stay a while and listen. Today we will cover something that hasn't been covered on this channel so far, and that is World War I, also known as the Great War. This war has brought about many books and autobiographies, the most famous being Nothing New on the Western Front by Erich Maria Remarque, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with. It has become the de facto go-to account of the war and is part of most school curricula in Western Europe. It paints a bleak picture of the conflict, sprung from the rather pacifist mind of its author, who was forced to partake in this proverbial, sometimes literal meat grinder. The book has become a cornerstone of the anti-war sentiment that is common in this day and age and gets cited regularly when people talk about the horrors of armed conflict. This video series is not about that book. In fact, it's not about the horrors of war, but about war being a part of human nature, being the ultimate challenge, and something that has to be overcome whether you like it or not, and as such, as something that will either crush you or make you stronger. This series is about Storm of Steel by Ernst Jünger. Storm of Steel, as a consequence, is a rather controversial book. You see, Remarque via his protagonist Paul Bäumer paints the picture of a reluctant soldier that gets put into pointlessly life-threatening situations time and time again, who questions the conflict at every corner, who criticizes his superiors for their blatant disregard of the common soldier's life and gives a horrifying account of the conditions at the front. Jünger, on the other hand, is a completely different character. Born in 1895 as the first of 7 children to a high-profile apothecary, he not only accepts his fate, he revels in it. He volunteers countless times to be a shock trooper, to conduct nightly patrols into no man's land, and his account of life at the front is, shall we say, quite different. But you will find out about that when the book commences, believe me. Storm of Steel was first published in 1920 and is Jünger's first book. It describes his experience in World War I from 1914 all the way to the end of the war in late 1918. Jünger joined as an infantry officer and was in the thick of it the entire time. He was wounded no less than 14 times and received the Iron Cross as well as the Pour le Mérite, the highest military decoration for bravery in Prussia at the time. In fact, he was the youngest recipient of this award ever, as well as the last living recipient until his death in 1998. After the war, Jünger became an established author and publicist and produced a variety of books. Jünger himself is a colorful character, and I will tell you many more things about him during this series, but just as a small tidbit, Jünger had always been an adventurous man, and before his escapades in World War I, he actually joined the French Foreign Legion in 1913 while still being a schoolboy, because he wanted to visit Africa. But after an intervention by the German Foreign Ministry, his contract was voided because of his age, and he was repatriated to Germany shortly after. But that's another story for another time. The same goes for his friendship with German chemist Albert Hofmann, who discovered a certain psychotropic substance in 1938, which you all are familiar with, and with whom Jünger conducted synthesis and self-experimentation with said substance in his dining room. Today, I will bring you Storm of Steel, edited and read by me, to make it accessible in this format. A unique account, quite different from most other mainstream accounts of this conflict. So, sit back, relax, enjoy a beverage of your choice. I am your host Jay. Roll the intro. Preface to the English edition by the author himself. It is not impossible that among the English readers of this book there may be one who in 1915 or 1916 was in one of those trenches that were woven like a web among the ruins of Monchy-aux-Bois. In that case, he had opposite him at the time the 73rd Hanoverian Fusiliers, who wear as their distinctive badge a brassard with Gibraltar inscribed on it in gold, in memory of the defense of that fortress under General Elliot. For this, besides Waterloo, has its place in the regiment's history. At the time I refer, I was a 19-year-old lieutenant in command of a platoon, and my part in the line was easily recognizable from the English side by a row of tall, shell-stripped trees that rose from the ruins of Monchy. My left flank was bounded by the sunken road leading to Berle-aux-Bois, which was in the hands of the English. My right marked by a sap running out from our lines, one that helped us many a time to make our presence felt by means of bombs and rifle grenades. I dare say this reader remembers too the white tomcat, lamed in one foot by a stray bullet, who had his headquarters in no man's land. He used often to pay me a visit at night in my dugout. This creature, the sole living being that was on visiting terms with both sides, always made on me an impression of extreme mystery. This charm of mystery which lay over all that belonged to the other side, to that danger zone full of unseen figures, is one of the strongest impressions that the war has left with me. At that time, before the Battle of the Somme, which opened a new chapter in the history of the war, the struggle had not taken the grim and mathematical aspect which cast over its landscapes a deeper and deeper gloom. There was more rest for the soldier than in the later years, when he was thrown into one murderous battle after another, and so it is that many of those days come back to my memory now with a light on them that is almost peaceful. In our talks in the trenches, in the dugout, or on the fire step, we often talked of the Tommy, and, as any genuine soldier will easily understand, we spoke of him very much more respectfully than was commonly the case with the newspapers of those days. There is no one less likely to disparage the lion than the lion hunter. Indeed, the landscape in which we lived at the time had something about it of primeval Africa, with two mighty forces of nature locked in conflict there. It was only now and again that one caught the sight of a brownish-yellow fleeting shadow against the desolate countryside that stretched on and on before one's eyes, or heard, after creeping through the wire at night, a whisper or a cough from a post. The distant sound of transport, a cloud of smoke from a fire hidden from view, fresh chalk spoil thrown out on the tortured ground, the monotonous duel of the guns stretching on from week to month, those were the signs that we puzzled over as though they were the runes of a secret book or the spoor of some mighty and unknown beast that came nightly to drink. As time went on, it grew more and more dangerous to lift a corner of the veil that fell like a magic hood over the spectre that was at once so near and so fatally far off. Raids undertaken to get a glimpse of the enemy's lines, and some information about what was going on there became less frequent and more exacting as the volume and mass of war material increased. A more and more terrific barrage had to be put down before 10 or 20 picked men, armed to the teeth, could make their occasional and exceedingly brief appearances in the opposing trenches. What these survivors brought back with them was the memory of a rapid and frantic glance into Vulcan's white-hot cauldron. Still, there were moments of another kind when the deep discord and the even deeper unity of this landscape came more clearly to one's mind. It was strange, for example, to hear at night the cry of the partridges from the waste fields, or at dawn the careless song of the lark as it rose high above the trenches. Did it not seem that that life itself was speaking out of the confidence of its savage and visionary heart, knowing very well that in its more secret and essential depths it had nothing to fear from even the deadliest of wars, and going its way quite unaffected by the superficial interchange of peace and war? But then, too, did not this life, ruthless towards its creatures, superior to the pain and pleasure of the individual, looking on with indifference while its passive forces were melted down in the crucible of war, enter very clearly even into the soldier's simple mind? Many a time, in that quiet interlude after sunset before the very first very lights went up, this message was brought very near to the soul by the song of an outlying post waiting for the night relief. There was a deeper homesickness there than any peace in this world can set to rest. Then the fire step was manned once more, the relief moved off along the communication trenches, and the brisker rifle fire of the night time broke out. The ear was again on stretch to catch the pulse beat of that other life under arms over there in the darkness. And often the very lights went up in dozens and the trench got lively when a patrol had crept up to our wire. Today there is no secret about what those trenches concealed, and a book such as this may, like a trench map years after the event, be read with sympathy and interest by the other side. But there not only the blue and red lines of the trenches are shown, but the blood that beat and the life that lay hid in them. Time only strengthens my conviction that it was a good and strenuous life, and that the war, for all its destructiveness, was an incomparable schooling of the heart. The frontline soldier whose foot came down on the earth so grimly and harshly may claim this at least, that it came down cleanly. Warlike achievements are enhanced by the inherent worth of the enemy. For all the troops who were opposed to the Germans on the great battlefields, the English were not only the most formidable, but the manliest and the most chivalrous. I rejoice, therefore, to have an opportunity of expressing in time of peace the sincere admiration which I have never failed to make clear during the war whenever I came across a wounded man or a prisoner belonging to the British force. Chapter 1. Orainville. The train stopped at Bazancourt, a small town in the Champagne, and there we got out. With unbelievable awe we listened to the slow pulsation of the machinery of the front, a tune to which long years were to accustom us. Far away the white ball of shrapnel shell melted into the grey December sky. The breath of the war passed by us with its peculiar horror. Did we imagine that nearly every one of us would be swallowed up in the days when that dull muttering over there broke out into unceasing thunder, one earlier, another later? We had left the lecture room, the classroom, and the bench behind us. We had been welded by a few weeks of training into one corporate mass inspired by the enthusiasm of the thought to carry forward the German ideals of 1870. We had grown up in a material age, and in each one of us there was a yearning for a great experience such as we had never known. The war had entered into us like wine. We had set out in a rain of flowers to seek the death of heroes. The war was our dream of greatness, power, and glory. It was a man's work, a duel on fields whose flowers would be stained with blood. There is no lovelier death in the world, anything rather than stay at home, anything to make one with the rest. Our fevered thoughts cooled down as we marched through the heavy chalk loam of the Champagne. Pack and ammunition and rifle weighed on us like lead. At last we reached the village of Orainville, the rest place of the 73rd Fusiliers, a little spot typical of that neighborhood, consisting of 50 cottages built of brick or flint round a park-enclosed chateau. The traffic in the village street was strange to eyes accustomed to peace conditions. There were only a few uneasy and unkempt civilians to be seen. Everywhere there were soldiers in worn or torn coats, with tanned faces and thick beards, who went to and fro with long swinging strides, or lounging in small groups at the cottage doors, assailed us newcomers with chaff. At one place there was a cooker smelling of bean soup and surrounded by a ration party clattering dixies. The Wallenstein-like romance was heightened by the incipient dilapidation of the village. After spending our first night in a huge barn, we were paraded before the adjutant, Lieutenant, as he then was, von Brixen, in the courtyard of the chateau and told off to our companies, mine being the 9th. Our first day of the war was destined to make a very distinct impression on us. We were sitting in the schoolhouse where we were quartered, having breakfast. Suddenly, there was a series of heavy explosions close by, and soldiers rushed from every house and crowded to the entrance of the village. We followed their example without knowing why. Again, there was the peculiar whisper and fluster overhead that we had never heard, drowned in a terrific crash. I was surprised to see the men round me crouching as if bent under terrific pressure. Immediately after, black groups appeared in the empty village street, bearing black bundles on stretchers or on joined hands. A feeling of unreality oppressed me as I stared at the figure streaming from blood, whose limbs hung loose and who unceasingly gave a hoarse cry for help, as though death had him already by the throat. He was carried into a cottage with the Red Cross flag over the door. What was all this then? The war had shown its claws and torn off its pleasant mask. It was so mysterious, so impersonal. One had scarcely given a thought to the enemy carrying on his secret and malignant existence somewhere behind. The impression of something arising entirely from beyond the pale of experience was so strange that it was difficult to see the connection of things. It was like a ghost at noon. A shell had hit the entrance of the chateau and had struck a mass of stones and masonry into the doorway just as the inmates, terrified by the previous shell bursts, were flocking out. There were 13 casualties, among them the bandmaster, Gebhardt, whom I knew well by sight from the promenade concerts at Hanover. A horse standing tied up at the steps realized the danger before the human beings and, breaking loose, galloped unhurt into the courtyard. I could tell from talking to my companions that this episode had somewhat damped their martial ardor. It had affected me too. I seldom heard the rumble of a passing lorry without mistaking it for the sound of that deadly shell. In any case, however, it was our fate all through the war to start at any sudden and unexpected sound. Whether a train clattered by, or a book fell on the floor, or a cry rang out at night, the heart always stood still for a moment in the belief that some great and unknown danger threatened. It was a sign of living 4 years under the shadow of death. The effect upon the dark regions that lie beneath the consciousness was so deep that at the least interruption of the usual course, death started up with warning hand, or as he does in those clocks where he appears above the dial at every hour with sandglass and scythe. It was a sensation over which habit could not prevail, since the instinct of self-preservation remains always the same. The notion that a soldier becomes hardier and bolder as war proceeds is mistaken. What he gains in the science and art of attacking his enemy, he loses in strength of nerve. The only dam against this loss is a sense of honor so resolute that few attain it. For this reason, I consider that troops composed of boys of 20 under experienced leadership are the most formidable. On the evening of the same day came the moment we had so long desired when, heavily laden, we set out for the line. Our way led through Pétricourt, whose ruins stood up fantastically in the dusk, to a lonely ranger's lodge concealed in pine woods known as the Fasanerie. This was the battalion reserve, and the 9th Company was in reserve till that night. The officer commanding was Lieutenant R. Brahms. We reported and were detained to our platoons, and soon found ourselves surrounded by bearded, mud-caked companions who greeted us with a certain ironical good humor. They asked us how things were going in Hanover and whether the war was going to end soon. Then the talk fell to laconic remarks about trenches, cookers, shell fire, and other matters of trench warfare. After a while, there was a shout to turn out at the entrance of our hut-like shelter. We fell in with our sections, and at the command Laden und Sichern, we put a clip of live cartridges into the magazine with secret joy. Then, in silence and in single file, we went across country through the night in a landscape studded with clumps of woodland. Now and then a single shot rang out, or a rocket fizzed up, and after a brief and ghastly illumination left the darkness blacker than before. The dull clank of rifles and entrenching tools was varied by the warning cry, "Look out! Wire!" Then, suddenly a rattle and a crash and a curse. "Can't you open your mouth when there's a shell hole coming?" The corporal takes up the tale. "Shut up, blast you! Do you think the French have mud in their ears?" We get on quicker. The dark of the night, the glimmer of a very light, the slow flicker of rifle fire induce a tremulous, alert state of the nerves. Occasionally, a chance bullet sinks by, cool and thin, overhead, and is lost in the distance. How often since then have I gone up to the line in a mood half of excitement and half of melancholy through scenes of utter desolation. Finally, we were lost to the sight in one of those trenches that wind like white serpents through the night to the front line. Once there, I awoke to find myself alone and shivering. I was staring intently over the parapet at the row of firs in front of the trench, among which my fancy conjured up shadowy figures on every side, while now and then a stray bullet crashed through the branches. The only change during these almost endless hours was that an older hand took me by a long, narrow sap to a post in front of the line, and there we occupied ourselves, as I had done before, in keeping a lookout. For 2 hours after that, I was allowed to sleep the sleep of exhaustion in a bare hole in the chalk. By dawn, I was white and chalky as the rest. I felt as though I had lived this mole's life for months. The regiment's front was opposite the village of Le Gouda in the chalk hills of the Champagne. On the right was the destroyed Garnet wood, then the line zigzagged through large fields of sugar beet, among which the red trousers of those who had fallen in previous attacks were conspicuous, and ended in low ground where touch with the 74th had to be maintained by means of night patrols. The beck flowed over the weir of a destroyed mill, surrounded by gloomy trees. It was an eerie spot to be in when the moon threw shifting shadows between rifts of cloud, and when strange sounds seemed to be mingled with the murmur of the water and the whisper of the reeds. Trench life here was as exhausting as it well could be. The day began before dawn, when every man had to be standing to. From 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., only 2 men from each section might be sleeping, which worked out at 2 hours sleep per man, and even this, owing to being wakened earlier or having straw to fetch and one thing or another to attend to, was often illusory. Either we were on guard in the trench, or else we went out to one of the numerous posts which were connected with the front line by long saps. These posts were intended to add security to the front line, but as trench warfare developed, they were found too exposed and were given up. This endless and terribly exhausting round of night guards was endurable in fine weather and even in frost. They were a positive torture when it rained, and it usually does in January. When the wet penetrated first the ground sheet pulled over your head, then coat and tunic, then trickled hour after hour down your skin, there resulted a state of depression that was impervious even to the cheering sounds of the relief wading along towards you. The first light of dawn shone on exhausted, chalk-smeared figures that, with chattering teeth and white faces, threw themselves down on the dirty straw of the dripping shelter. Though those shelters, they were holes hacked out in the solid chalk wall of the trench and covered with a layer of boards and a few shovels of soil. When it rained, they dripped the whole day after. With a certain gallows humor, they were called dripping wells, men's baths, and so on. If more than one desired to take their rest in them, they were compelled to put their legs in the trench, where they formed excellent man-traps for passers-by. Under these circumstances, there was little question of sleep during the day, even if there had not been 2 hours on guard, cleaning the trench, fetching food, coffee and water, and a lot else. It may be imagined that this unaccustomed life came very hard on us, particularly as the old soldiers were quite knowing enough to take advantage of us in every manner. They brought this habit with them from life in barracks, and in this way added some bitterness to days hard enough already. There was an end to it, however, when we had once been under fire together. The common soldier could not easily swallow the fact that we were volunteers. He took it to be a sort of bumptiousness on our part. I often encountered this notion during the war. It was not much better when the company was in reserve. Our quarters were small mud huts covered with branches of fir trees near the Fasanerie or in Hilaire Wood, where the ground deep in manure gave at least the pleasant warmth of a hotbed. Many a time one walked in a puddle inches deep. Though up to now I had known rheumatism only by name, it was not many days before I felt it in every joint through being always wet to the skin. Here too the nights were not for sleeping. They were used for deepening the numerous communication trenches. A ray of light in this scene of dreary monotony was the arrival of the cooker every evening at the corner of Hilaire Wood. When the lid was taken off the Dixies, a wonderful smell of beans and bacon or something else as delightful was wafted aboard. But here too there was a dark spot. Desiccated vegetables, reviled by fastidious gourmets as wire entanglements or damaged crops. Under January the 6th I even find in my diary the following indignant observation. It reads, "In the evening the cooker waddled up and brought a filthy mess, probably stewed up out of frozen turnips." On the other hand, under the 14th, there is the enthusiastic entry, "Wonderful bean soup, 4 rations, pangs of satiety." We had an eating competition and disputed which position was the best for putting it down. I was for standing to it. The days of rest at Orainville were the best. They were spent in having one's sleep out, cleaning equipment and training. The company was quartered in a huge barn which had 2 stepladder stairs as the only way in. We had stoves in spite of the building being full of straw. One night I rolled into one of them and was only awakened by the attentions of several of my pals who were making violent efforts to extinguish me. To my horror, I found my uniform was badly charred behind, and in consequence I had to go about for a considerable time in a species of frock coat. After a short while with the regiment, we had pretty well lost the illusion with which we had set out. Instead of the dangers we had hoped for, only mud and work and sleepless nights had fallen to our lot, and the conquest of these called for a heroism that was little to our taste. The continuous exhaustion, too, was in part the fault of the higher command, which had not yet grasped the spirit of modern trench warfare. In a short war of movement, the officer both can and must take it out of his men without regard, but in a war that drags on, this leads to physical collapse. The immense number of posts and the continual digging were for the most part unnecessary and even harmful. Trenches are not the first thing, but the courage and freshness of the men behind them. Battles are won by iron hearts in wooden ships, it says. Certainly in the trenches we heard a few bullets whistle and now and then had a few shells over from the ram force, but these small experiences of war were far beneath our expectations. All the same, we were often reminded of the murderous reality that lay behind these apparently aimless incidents. For example, on the 8th January, a shell hit the Fasanerie and killed Lieutenant Schmidt, the adjutant of the battalion. On the 27th January, in honor of the Kaiser, 3 hurrahs rang out, and along the whole length of the front, "Hail to thee, Conqueror's Wrath," was sung to the accompaniment of the enemy's rifle fire. During these days I had a most unpleasant experience which nearly brought my military career to an inglorious conclusion. The company was on the left flank, and towards dawn, after a night entirely without sleep, I and another had to do double sentry go in the low-lying ground. Owing to the cold, I had, against orders, thrown my blanket over my head and was leaning against a tree. My rifle was resting on a bush close behind me. Suddenly there was a noise behind me. Out went my hand. The rifle was gone. The officer on duty had slipped up behind me and got hold of it without being observed. As a summary punishment, he sent me armed with a pickaxe towards the French posts about 100 meters away, a Red Indian idea that nearly cost me my life. For during the course of my remarkable penalty patrol, a patrol of 3 volunteers crept forwards throughout the rushes and was seen and shot at by the French. One, called Lang, was hit and never seen again. As I was standing close by, I got my share of one of those platoon salvos, then so much in favor, and the twigs of the willow beside me whistled round my ears. I clenched my teeth and stood where I was, out of pure cussedness. I've never been able to forgive this NCO, who soon after was severely wounded and got his discharge for this dirty trick. We were all heartily pleased when we heard that we were at last to be taken out, and we celebrated our departure from Orainville by a tremendous beer drinking in the huge barn. On the 4th February of 1915, we were relieved by a Saxon regiment and marched to Bazancourt. That month, the hardest of the whole war for me, was a good schooling all the same. It made me thoroughly familiar with the whole round of trench duties and fatigues in their severest form. This experience stood me in good stead later when, without it, I might, as an officer, have demanded the impossible of my men. And here we go. The first episode of Storm of Steel is done. The audible cue you just heard denotes the end of each episode, and that now the after-action report will commence. For this first episode, we have our author talk about his arrival at the front and how instead of fighting the enemy, he has to manage life at the front line for a couple of weeks. This, as you've heard, was quite different from his life back home and extremely challenging. Not least because some random NCO decided to discipline Ernst for leaving his rifle out of reach by sending him on what was pretty much a suicide mission. Thankfully he survived, and he even got some good insight out of it. This is something I can relate to as well. When I joined the army and went through basic training, it was quite obvious who of the junior and senior leaders were good and who were catastrophically bad. Good leadership is something you can learn, even when you're not instinctively gifted with the skill set. You just have to want to become a good leader. Experiencing bad leadership as a grunt works pretty well in deducing what works and what doesn't work. In fact, during officer training, 2 core tenets had been drilled into us back in the day. 1, if you want to lead, you have to learn how to follow first, and 2, if you want to lead people, you have to like people. Both of these are true, I can tell you that for free. As for Ernst, he will have ample chance to display his skills in the future. We shall learn about that soon. In fact, his leadership advice is something I took to heart very early on in my career, and it's what makes his book one that has left a lasting impression on me. We'll see how it plays out in the next episode. Now, if you've made it this far, consider subscribing and hitting the bell to please the algorithm. Also, let me know what you think about the book so far. I read every single comment and try to reply to all of them. See you then, stay safe, cheers.